conference organizers for giving us the opportunity to present here today. So my name is Kuzborska, as you introduced. I'm from the University of York, and today I'm going to present with my colleague, Dr. Xinyang Sun from Xi'an Jiatong Liverpool University. Our colleague, Dr. Bill Soden from the University of York couldn't be here today, but he's sending his best regards. So the topic of our presentation is designing a theoretical framework for investigating the construction of authorial voice through citations. So in this talk, I will give a brief overview of various explanations of voice, and will also give our definition that we adopted in our study. My colleague Xinyang will then outline some of the ways that the authorial voice could be constructed in writing, and will introduce you to the framework that we use to analyze the construction of voice through citations in students' writing. And in the end, she will give some implications for teachers and researchers. So why studying authorial voice? As we probably, many of us know, the construction of authorial voice is an important criterion for judging the success of students' academic writing in many universities. Students are required to distinguish between different voices advanced in text, including their own, and to adopt an identity as an author that maintains the control of other voices. However, as Hutchings observes, students do not immediately understand what it means when we say we want to hear their voice in their writing. And indeed, if we look at the literature, there are various interpretations of voice, and it could be really confusing. So for example, Hutchings explains the voice as the student's own views and the ability to present other views as other voices. So here we have students' engagement with viewpoints of others and their evaluation of those viewpoints conveyed through taking a position or so-called stance of their own. And so in the literature, we can see that voice and stance, they have been interpreted sometimes similarly, sometimes differently. So we can see that they have close connections, but they are not the same, as I'm going to explain in the next slide. So, for example, Hyland says that stance refers to writers' rhetorically expressed attitude to the propositions in a text, and voice to the writer's attitude to a given community. So as this definition indicates, stance is an aspect of voice and can contribute to the construction of voice, but is not the same. Voice has also been conceptualized as individual and social voice, and so to better understand what the voice is, it's useful to look at these distinctions as well. So individual voice is generally associated with authenticity, authoritativeness, ownership, and Clark's and Ivanich autobiographical self can be seen as individual voice, although their views of voice are also social. So autobiographical self, according to Clark and Ivanich, is made apparent by the inclusion of the writer's own life history, as well as experiences, values, and beliefs. So in other words, it's about writers' opinions, beliefs. It's the self that writers bring to writing. Looking at voice from a social perspective, the emphasis is on the influence of social context in constructing voice, and how writers position themselves in relation to the text they draw upon, and to relation to disciplinary or other social groups to which they are linked. So for example, Tardy says that social voice could be explained as related to self-representation and authorial presence, but always taking into account the social worlds for and out of which a text is produced. So once again, we can say that voice is related to stance, but in relation to a specific context. Recently, we've got an understanding of voice as dialogic. And it has been argued that neither the social context nor writer influence the construction of voice, but is the result of both writer and social context. So from this perspective, the key emphasis is on the role of the reader in voice construction and the interaction between writers and readers and the resulting co-construction of voice at a particular time and space. So as a way of summarizing this conceptualization of voice, we found Clark and Ivanich 3 types of writers' textual identities useful here. And I already explained the autobiographical self. Now, the discoursal self is usually realized through the writer's display of features that are identifiable with specific discourse conventions. So for example, academic writing is characterized by citation use, the complexity of structures, specialized vocabulary. So it would be the extent to which writers adopt these conventions and write according to the perspectives of their specific communities. And the authorial self is realized when writers express their authoritativeness, including their own position in relation to other writers, their work. So it's actually the extent to which writers represent themselves in a text, articulate their stance, and claim themselves as the source of text content. And we also see in the literature that, especially recently, we've got the emphasis on the issues of access, power, interpersonal relations that play important roles in the author's construction of voice. So given these interpretations of voice in the literature, we also argue that it's important to construct both the discoursal self and the authorial self, and came up with the following definition of authorial voice. It is the writer's belief of themselves as authoritative and their active engagement with the voices of other writers, as well as their ongoing negotiations of specific disciplinary conventions that are essential for successful academic communication. Our definition is also in line with recent research on effective writing that has shown that effective writers, including successful students, they position themselves as authoritative in relation to the authors they cite in their texts, and as well in relation to their audiences. And in our study, we also acknowledge that the construction of voice is closely related to the aspects of power and a sense of self in a specific discourse community that writers see themselves in. So from in our study, the study on students' construction of voice, we acknowledge that students' perceptions and feelings about the extent to which they fit in with their new community, the extent to which they feel that they have the power to question other views and so adopt an identity as an author, all these have implications for the construction of authorial voice. So that was a brief overview of the concept of voice and the explanations of definition we adopted, of voice that we adopted in our study. Now I will hand the presentation over to my colleague Qingyan, who will explain some of ways of constructing authorial voice in writing, and who will introduce to the framework to analyze the construction of voice through citations. Qing, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Can you stop sharing? So I will share and share my screen. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so that was our definition of voice. Okay, so now I move on to how authorial voice can be constructed in writing. So it can be constructed in many different ways. So first of all, it could be through linguistic means, such as the use of language by the use of the word choices and also what sentence structure writers use. Okay, also it could be constructed by the use of citation forms. So we have the integral and non-integral citation forms. So for integral citations, there is more room for the writers to engage with the sources. While for non-integral citations, then the writer's voice will be more prominent because they will be leading the voice in their writing. It can also be achieved through the use of reporting verbs because they can, for reporting verbs, they can show different stances, different attitudes towards the content from the sources. Okay, so for all these components, we can see that they are all linked to the use of citations. So citations is an important part of the construction of authorial voice. And as we previously, as Elena has said, it's particularly interesting because citation is like, it shows the connection between an authorial self and a discursive self, right? Because authorial self is like showing personal values, while discursive self is also following the conventions. So citations is part of the convention students need to follow, but at the same time, they need to bring in their own authorial identities. Okay, so that's why we chose citation as our focus. And as we previously said, authorial voice is an important part for judging students' success in academic writing. And citation as well is an important part of this. So in our study, what we did is our purpose was to examine the students' rhetorical purposes for source use over time. And we also looked at their academic score. And also we focused on how the students acknowledged the sources and also evaluated them and also constructed authorial voice through citations. So we recruited 10 Chinese master students of TESOL in a UK university who all had a quite high level of language. Okay, so what we did with our data is we collected the students' assignments and their dissertation literature review chapters to look at their use of citations. We used Partridge's the adapted rhetorical framework of citations to analyze the students' citations. And also we conducted discourse-based interviews with these students to understand what they know about their own use of citations. All right, so here I'm showing Partridge's original framework of rhetorical functions of citations. So when she developed this, she based it on 16 European master students' dissertation, and that was in gender study. But still, many of these functions here are also applicable to other fields, other subjects. So we were particularly interested in this framework because it is a combination of citation forms, reporting verbs, and linguistic devices. So it doesn't just focus on one thing, but it looks at all of them and try to overall give a definition of whether which function it has. Okay, so in particular, we found that this function attribution is very relevant to our context because in Patrick's, her definition is attribution. Well, every citation has the function of attributing the information to a source. However, if there are no other functions, then it would be only attribution. So that means the student doesn't have any more higher order rhetorical functions. So if a text is full of attribution, then probably it doesn't show much authorial voice. Okay, so we decided this is very relevant for our study on students' writing. Okay, then we also found that evaluation is very relevant because it looks at to what extent the writer has evaluated the content from the sources through the use of such as evaluative language, adverbs, verbs, and also reporting verbs. Okay. And then links between sources is also very important because when the writer can show explicitly tell us what's the connection between different sources, then also they're demonstrating their authorial voice through engaging with other sources. So we picked these. So these functions, they all had they had more frequencies in our pilot study than the other functions, because some other functions, they only apply to the dissertation genre. So we decided to use these three, which are more applicable to students' text for general coursework and also for the literature review chapters. Okay, so then we chose these three, and then we found that within links between sources, there were further subcategories. So sometimes students just give a group citation like this. We define that as generalization. This is kind of showing an implicit link. So it's grouping the contents, but it doesn't say explicitly like what are the connections between the sources. And then there's compare and contrast. So this is more explicit. For example, this one, okay, both of their definitions. So that's saying explicitly what are the similarity or differences between two or more sources. So exemplification also is showing relationship between a wider body of literature and particular sources. Okay, positive and negative evaluation. That's commenting whether that's the writer's attitudes towards the source. Okay, so then we used it to analyze our students' text. Okay, for example, this one by Elsa. This is a quite well-written paragraph with a quite good structure. So the first citation we coded as attribution because there was no other particular function. And the second one we found that's a compare and contrast because it says who and who also express. Yeah, and then in addition, both point out. So that's again compare and contrast. The final one, now this is also attribution. So although there's a word nevertheless, which could suggest a contrast function, but when we closely looked at the contents of the sources, we found that actually this Cook, the content, it has no link with the previous two citations. Okay, now this is another student. So she appears to have used some generalization, but in fact, we can see that it's just superficially grouped by the typos technology of these sources. So there's no evidence that the student really was aware of the purpose why she used these sources together. Okay, now this one is very rare in our corpus. This is when the student is showing a negative evaluation on the source. So Kapner here, and says, but this experiment failed to consider other forms of feedback. Okay, so that's how we use this framework. So some summary is, firstly, we define the construction of voice through the use of citations. And then at the same time, we acknowledge that the construction of voice will differ according to different contexts, and student writers may use different writer identities according to different situations. For example, they may choose to demonstrate another identity for another piece of coursework. Okay, and in the case for our student, what we found in the study is they did adopt a community voice, which is they try to use citations to follow the conventions, which is the expectation of them. And at the same time, we found that they tend to express their own social and cultural identities. Okay, so it's crucial that when we investigate their practices, we also hear the students' explanations for their own citation uses. So following on previously, we said readers' co-construction of authorial voice. Okay, some implication for teaching then is we could teach authorial voice through citation, so that could be more specific and less vague. Okay, We can show excerpts for students to know how to use citations. We need to look at the overall effects of the passage. Yeah, we need to co-construct voice together with our students. Okay, some implication for research is we need to analyze it through global understanding of citation with its context. We need both the researchers and writers' interpretation of the citation functions. And further, well, we use the manual coding for all our citations. So in the future, could corpus linguistics methods on citation be helpful for citation analysis? Okay, so that's our references. Okay, so we're happy to answer any questions.